housekeeping. First of all, welcome. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. The structure of this event will first be introductions, a program with Edwin Hagenstein. Lastly, some time to take some questions and comments. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to type in your concern in the chat box and I'll assist you there. To ask a question or make a comment, feel free to raise your hand to be unmuted and ask your question or make your comment, or you can type it in the chat box or the Q&A box and I will ask for you and we will address those at the appropriate time. Let me introduce you to Ed. Edwin Hagenstein worked in educational publishing for 3 decades as a textbook writer and editor, specializing in history and social studies. During that time, he often considered how best to convey the fundamentals of American government to young readers and concluded that vocabulary was key. In researching the language of liberty, he found that even the most familiar political terms had surprising depths. His previous book, American Georgics, Writings on Farming, Culture, and the Land, won honorable mention for the 2011 New England Book Festival in the Compilations Anthologies category. Hagenstein now lives and works in northern New Mexico. Please welcome Edwin Hagenstein and the Language of Liberty. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that. Thanks very much. As Jessica was saying, we'll do a little reading from my book, but I wanted to give some a little fuller background information on what it is and what it's like. As she mentioned, the subtitle for the book is it's The Language of Liberty, A Citizen's Vocabulary. And in it, what I do is I take 101 political terms and write what are in effect mini essays, brief essays, 2 or 3 pages generally, so they're not too long, that give definitions or practical working definitions of the different terms, but also explore the terms a little more fully so that anybody who reads them gets a bit better sense of the fuller meanings of these terms, where they came from, and their importance in our political dialogue, our political discourse. That is sort of a general thing, 101 terms. I chose the terms for usefulness. Most of the terms would be very, very familiar to most people. Senate, democracy, terms like that, president, veto, all the terms that you'll likely hear when you're listening to the news. A few are a little less familiar, a little more obscure, but I thought all of them are important for putting together a kind of a picture of our whole political system. I had a nice comment from a reader up in Minnesota who said that reading this is a little like putting together a puzzle. Each entry gives you a piece, you get a sense of the shape of that piece, and then you can start fitting it together with all the other pieces. And as you do that, the picture, sort of, you get a fuller and fuller picture. And I like that comment because that's very much what I hope to achieve with this book. Picture of the whole government, the whole constitutional system, really doing it piece by piece. So that's a kind of a general, very general overview. One other thing I think I'd like to say about the book, and that has to do with the research and reading that I did that went into it. There were a number of years where I really just devoted myself to that reading. And so it was a lot and it covered a lot of ground. But if I had to choose one term to describe all that reading and all that research and all that sort of cogitating, I think it would be remedial, because this is all information. What goes into this book, what went into this book, was kind of basic civic information that I feel like I didn't really get in high school. I should have. I went to what was thought to be a very good high school outside Boston, and I wasn't a terrible student, and I was interested in politics. But when I was done with my formal education, I feel like I didn't really have some of the basic institutional understanding that I really should have had, and that really forms kind of the backbone of this book, the heart of this book. And so I think of the reading and effort that went into this as kind of remedial for myself, and it might be sort of remedial for a lot of other people, because if I didn't get this stuff in high school, I graduated way back in 1979. My guess is there are a lot of people over the years who didn't get this as well. And in fact, I think we've probably raised a couple of generations now of people who, if they manage to get kind of a basic civic education, a really civically literate, they had to have gotten it on their own, I suspect. I don't think it's easy to come by in our educational system. So that's something that I hope to achieve with this book, to put out there, to let people gain access to some basic institutional information, some basic concepts about our government and our political system that they might not get otherwise. So that's a hope with the book here. Maybe one last thing before we get started in reading. I'll say something about the structure of the entries. As I said, there's 101 entries. Every entry opens with a quotation, and it's something that I was collecting quotations all along for years and years. And I find that opening with a quotation is a useful way to focus attention, bring some ideas into, sort of crystallize some ideas and bring them into focus before getting into the heart of the reading. So each one that I read today, and I'll probably do part or all of 3 entries, each of them will open with a quotation. Another thing about the entries is that they divide into separate sections, and typically the first section of every reading, of every entry, will include something like a working definition of the term, maybe a little bit of background and so forth, but some kind of a definition there. Subsequent sections of the readings, I sort of shift gears a little bit, and that allows me to explore different dimensions of the term, whatever term it is. So as I read today, I will let you know when one section is ending and another section begins. So that's kind of the background information. My entries run something of a gamut from pretty narrow and pretty technical to broader and more philosophical. The first one you get here is one of the more narrow ones. And it has to do with the term statute. So I'll start with the quotation. This quotation comes from a guy named Benjamin Cardozo, who was an important Supreme Court justice in the middle of the 20th century. He was also a very scholarly man, a great legal scholar. So he said this, quote, "The Constitution overrides a statute, but a statute, if consistent with the Constitution, overrides the law of judges," end quote. And the first section begins this way. A statute is, first of all, a law, but a law that comes from a particular source. Statutes are laws passed by legislative bodies, such as the United States Congress, or the Parliament of the United Kingdom, or the legislatures of our 50 states. When a civics text discusses bills that become laws, they have statutes in mind. Since legislatures represent the people, the laws they pass express the people's will as well as can be. This imbues statutes with a special force, which is why, as Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo pointed out, they override what he called the law of judges. What Cardozo meant was this: the law of judges, or the common law, is the law that has evolved through decisions made by judges case by case. Its source is the judges themselves, who apply the law as they inherit it, but also adapt it as they apply it to specific cases. The result is a large body of law that has evolved within the courts and is dependent on the authority of judges. Statutes differ. As acts of legislatures, they represent the will of the people more directly than laws that grow out of judges' decisions, and statutes trump those laws. To see the difference, consider one case from the world of publishing and of murder. In the late 1970s, David, son of Sam Berkowitz, was arrested for a series of grisly killings in New York City, for which he was tried and found guilty. After he was imprisoned for those crimes, however, rumors began to circulate that he was preparing to sell his story for publication. According to the judge-made legal tradition, there was nothing to prevent Berkowitz from doing so, nor from earning money from the deal. But the notion that Berkowitz would profit from his crimes outraged the public. In response, New York's legislature passed a statute that called for proceeds from such deals to be set aside for victims of the original crimes. Thus, a statute was passed which overrode laws that had evolved in the courts. Statutes, unlike judge-made laws, capture a definitive judgment at a particular time. They are an expression of the people's will and must be seen in this serious light. In keeping with this seriousness, the Constitution makes it difficult to pass statutes, placing various hurdles in the way, including a bicameral legislature and the presidential veto. Our state constitutions do likewise. I have a footnote here that points out that Nebraska has a unicameral, not a bicameral legislature, but most state constitutions do the same. Despite the rigors of the legislative process, wrong-headed laws are occasionally passed. Legislatures will at times pass statutes that violate the standards of the Constitution. In such cases, as Cardozo noted, statutes are overridden by the Constitution. If the Supreme Court determines that a statute violates the Constitution, the statute will be nullified. This has happened well over 100 times in this country to laws passed by Congress, and well over 1,000 times to state and local laws. So that's the end of one section, and I'll begin another one. Having distinguished statutes from constitutional and judge-made law, it's worth contrasting statutes with two other tools of government, both of which can be mistaken for statutory law. Statutes differ from governmental regulations, and they differ from executive orders. Regulations are the rules that are generated by governmental agencies, such as the Environmental Protection Agency or the Security and Exchange Commission. These agencies, and there are many of them at both state and national levels, produced a vast number of regulations that reach into every corner of American life. If you find yourself on the wrong end of them, you will surely feel as if you have broken the law when they are enforced. But regulations are not laws in the sense that statutes are. Likewise with executive orders. These are official statements through which a president can direct the way the agencies of the executive branch enact policies. Like regulations, executive orders have real legal force, but they are not laws themselves. The difference between statutes on the one hand and regulations and executive orders on the other is in the relative ease with which the latter can be changed. Regulations are produced by specific processes within given agencies, which can alter or remove them as well. These processes are separate from ones of the legislature and not subject to the hurdles of the lawmaking process found there. Executive orders come from presidents, and they too can be changed without the involvement of the legislature. For example, when Barack Obama held the presidency, he used executive orders to set key immigration policies. Yet without the force of statutes, his executive orders were open to reversal after he left office. When Donald Trump was elected, he was able to rescind elements of Obama's immigration policy with executive orders of his own. As the Constitution says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Regulations and executive orders have important uses, but they are not statutes, not products of legislation, and therefore they lack the force and stability of statutes. So that's a full entry on that term, statutes. And just a quick comment on that. Donald Trump's executive orders that overturned Barack Obama's executive orders were in turn overturned almost immediately by Joe Biden after he became president. And so that instability with executive orders and indicates kind of problem of using them as a tool of important policy making. Had they been statutes, they could not have been dealt with in that way. They couldn't be overturned with the same ease. If a law is passed, it can be unpassed by Congress, but that's a very difficult matter. It's difficult to make laws, to make statutes in the first place, and very difficult to undo them once they're made. That's an important distinction, I think, anyhow, and something that's sort of ripped from the headlines in a way. We see the executive order being used more and more in the last dozen years or so. To my way of thinking, it's a little bit dangerous to use them for establishing important policy. But that's just a comment from me. Anyhow, so that's one. I'll shift gears a little bit, and the next entry will be on the term demagogue, one that's also been in the news over the last handful of years. And so another term, demagogue. Quotation comes from H.L. Mencken, and one of the pleasures of working on this project was going back and reading Mencken a little bit. He was a very funny guy, and read him on his background reading for a couple of different entries in here. Anyhow, he had this to say, quote, "The demagogue is one who teaches doctrines he knows to be untrue to men he knows to be idiots." H.L. Mencken, end quote. And the entry begins this way. "As long as political words hold their meanings, demagogue will be a slur. When the accusation of demagoguery is made, it is, or ought to be, like a warning flare fired into the sky. There's trouble here and we need to pay attention. Demagogues are leaders who inflame destructive passions in the people, thereby corrupting our politics at its source. The word did not always have this negative cast. Demagogue is one of our oldest political terms with roots in ancient Greece. Its literal meaning is simply leader of the demos, or of the people. Etymologically, it's close to that other staple of our political vocabulary, democracy. Though demagogue was not necessarily pejorative for the Greeks, their philosophers did view the demos with a certain distrust. Ordinary people lacked the cultivation to understand the deeper demands of statecraft. In addition, the people were too self-interested and erratic to be politically dependable. Their leaders, demagogues, might share these faults, or worse, purposely play to them in order to amass power. H.L. Mencken shared the ancient opinion of the common man and carried it to a modern American extreme. His contempt for demagogues grew naturally from his disdain for democracy, its leaders, and indeed for the demos itself. Quote, "I confess," he wrote, "I enjoy democracy immensely. It's incomparably idiotic and hence incomparably amusing. Does it exalt dunderheads, cowards, trimmers, frauds, cads? Then the pain of seeing them go up is balanced and obliterated by seeing them come down," end quote. But if scorn for demagogues came easily to Mencken, it comes harder for those who embrace democracy. In siding with democracy, we take something of a gamble. We place our faith in the capacity of the public to act responsibly enough to secure our political future, to discern, for example, who are the trimmers, frauds, and cads, and to avoid voting for them. Discerning is easier said than done, however, and demagoguery is, in fact, a natural pitfall in democratic discourse. In a democracy, the health of the state is closely linked to the interests of ordinary people. Any aspiring leader in a democracy will pitch his or her rhetoric to the wants, needs, and hopes of ordinary people. We can hardly expect otherwise. Yet the potential for demagogy is obvious when politicians do so, and the line between fair and foul can be difficult to draw. It is the line between the appeal to voters' legitimate self-interest and the appeal to mere self-indulgence. To a degree, this difference is in the eye of the beholder. For conservatives, a good deal of progressive rhetoric is inherently demagogic. Free healthcare, free college, and the elimination of fossil fuels, these positions strike critics as unsustainable and as political pandering. To progressives, of course, they sound necessary. And as to demagoguery, the shoe is on the other foot, in their opinion. Donald Trump's 2016 campaign promised to build a wall between the United States and Mexico. Donald Trump's 2016 campaign promised to build a wall between the United States and Mexico, they think, plays to the worst aspects of American nationalism. To many progressives, the wall itself is pure demagoguery in massive physical form. Yet even charges of demagoguery can be demagogic. Standing in judgment over fellow citizens is a temptation best not indulged too freely. A healthy politics depends on the character traits that see most people through their personal lives, a degree of self-discipline, respect for others, and a sense of limits as to what we can demand of fellow citizens and from the world itself. Perhaps we find a clue to the nature of demagoguery exactly here, because the rhetoric of the demagogue undermines all of this. It nurtures grievances, contempt for others, and a sense of entitlement. This, playing to our weakness, is the mark of the demagogue and the source of the demagogue's power. And that's the end of the first section. I'm going to read the second section of this one. And it begins this way. To see demagoguery clearly, it helps to look at it from another viewpoint, that of the working politician. The job is twofold, at least for those who are elected to their positions. First is the task of winning the office itself, and here the uses of demagoguery will tempt them. Flattering the voters, overpromising, and caricaturing opponents are all winning tactics in political campaigns. And if a candidate is unconvinced of that, pollsters and party strategists will set them straight. The second aspect of the politician's job takes shape after the election and is roughly at odds with the first. Once elected, politicians need to legislate and to make policy. Given the structures of our political system, this inevitably means working with others to hammer out compromises and build a consensus around practical programs. The difficulty of this task is made worse by rhetorical claims made on the campaign trail. Writing laws that serve the needs of an exceptionally diverse society is not a process that allows every political promise to be honored. When an intransigent politician lands in a working legislature, it's like the proverbial monkey wrench falling into a machine. No legislator attempting the ticklish job of building a compromise among fractious colleagues wants to be harangued with campaign rhetoric from a colleague who cannot shift out of campaign mode. As one 20th century senator put it, quote, "Everybody hates a man who demagogues when the doors are closed," end quote. And that's the end of that entry on term demagogue. And as I say, it was fun. It was sort of amusing to go back and read H.L. Mencken, whom I had read some of a long time ago. He was a very a colorful guy, and you hardly ever get any more people who are willing to express, kind of vigorously anti-democratic opinions all the time, and he certainly did that. And so anyhow, it was interesting to go back and read him. And the term demagogue, of course, as I said, is one that's been in play a lot over the last bunch of years. And I think sort of necessarily so, because I sense a lot of demagoguery from all sides in the political discourse. A little disheartening, I think. I have one other reading I thought I would do. I won't read the whole I won't read the whole entry. It's a little more complex. It has to do with the term equality. Certainly one that comes up all the time in our political discourse, going back to the founding. obviously an important aspiration on our part, but it's a complex term too. And so I thought I would read that, get into some of the complexities, and we'll see how that goes. But like I say, an important term. This is one of the sort of more, a little bit unusual in one way, in that it gets two opening quotations. There are just a couple of terms that get two. Equality is one. And the first quotation just comes directly from the Declaration of Independence. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." End quote. The second quotation comes from a professor of sort of legal philosophy, emeritus now. He's retired, I think, from the University of Michigan, but a guy whom I admired a great deal and read a handful of his books, and his name is Joseph Vining. So from Joseph Vining, quote, "Is equality natural, resting on observation of the facts? Some individuals are slyer, cleverer, physically stronger, smarter, more courageous, more ruthless, more charismatic, often vastly so. Some are more devoted to family or more capable of long-term strategy and waiting. Equality has to push hard and constantly against the facts." End quote. It's worth pondering a little bit. So my writing begins this way. Equality holds a complicated place in American civic life. It is central to our political self-understanding. According to the great testament of our political faith, the Declaration of Independence, we believe in equality as a basic, even self-evident truth. All people are created equal. Having embraced this ideal, however, we're profoundly conflicted about how to live up to it. The essential meaning of equality is clear enough. It actually comes to politics from that clearest of worlds, mathematics. There, equal means the same or equivalent. 2 + 2 is the same as 4. Likewise, in political life, people are equal in the sense that all are the same in some fundamental way, sharing equally in their irreducible value as humans. However, political logic is not mathematical. Politics is thoroughly human, with each individual involved, both the governed and the governors, being a unique mix of willfulness, decency, ambition, intelligence, physical disability, and more. Equality is a perfect ideal, can never be fully at home here, which is not to say that the principle of equality has no place in politics, as the founders, of course, insisted. John Adams captured the essence of their view when he wrote that we should have, quote, "a government of laws, not of men," end quote. We shall be governed, he hoped, as equals. We should be judged impartially under the laws. None should be privileged by rank, and none should be burdened by its lack. If the concept of equality has any meaning in American political life, it can be found here. A rejection of rank and status, however, is not the same as an embrace of equality as an ideal. In the founders' vision, liberty was the goal, quote, "the first object of government," end quote, as James Madison wrote, not equality. The free exercise of one's talents, whatever the result, must be protected by law. In this, the founders understood that freedom would lead to differing, that is, unequal, outcomes for citizens. James Madison said as much in Federalist 10, quote, "From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results," end quote. We see here a distinction that remains critical in our politics today. The American founding embraced what can be called the equality of opportunity. People have equal rights under the law, to the, quote, "pursuit of happiness." But this equality of opportunity is no guarantee of any equality of outcome. In fact, the first ensures the latter's absence. As political scientist Harvey Mansfield wrote, quote, "The hard name for equality of opportunity is inequality," end quote. That's the end of the first section of this entry. And what I'd like to do is skip over a section which has to do with that first section. It has to do with the equality of opportunity. The next section has to do with equality of outcome and the attempts we've made to kind of redress the imbalances that result from equality of opportunity that we were just talking about that lead to inequality. We have made plenty of efforts over a couple hundred years now, more recently than earlier, to deal with those kind of troublingly unequal outcomes. And so that's what the next section is about, but I'm going to skip that one and go to a third section of this entry. And it's one that I think has this section has particular meaning for us these days. And it begins this way. There is another dimension of equality to consider, one distinct from both equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. It might be called equality of respect, and it concerns the way in which citizens regard each other, whether we see each other as equals or as something else. Democracy depends on this form of equality. Some degree of mutual respect among citizens is necessary for its well-being, indeed for its survival. Mutual loathing is a poor mortar for building a democratic society. Of course, it's hardly new for politics to be plagued with hatreds. Governing always reflects some of the darker aspects of our nature. Moreover, as individuals, we inevitably invest politics with deep feelings of personal identity and our attachment to some in-group. While politics has often brought out tribal feelings in societies, the politics of identity has a peculiar grip on our spirits today. More even than religion, many Americans see politics as the crucible in which we fight it out over good and evil. And it's hard to see the place in such an environment for equality with its implied respect for others. At least one observer thinks that we face a deep crisis in this regard. Quote, "The American Republic's essence had been self-restraint toward fellow citizens deemed equals," end quote, wrote political science Angelo Codevilla in 2018. And then he picks up, quoting him again, "Because a majority of Americans no longer share basic sympathies and trust, because they no longer regard each other as worthy of equal consideration, the public and private practices that once had made our republic are now beyond reasonable hope of restoration. Strife can only mount until some new equilibrium among us rises," end quote. Whether Codevilla's fears are fully justified or not, we would do well to consider what practices, civic, intellectual, or spiritual, might diminish the animosities that rack our current political life and restore a measure of equal respect among fellow citizens. And that's the end of that, that entry on equality. Just a quick note, it's probably a minor thing, but Angelo Codevilla, the fellow I was quoting at the end there, who has such a dim view of where we are in our political life and such concern, just actually died 2 days ago, I think. Traffic accident in Boston. And he was an interesting guy. I don't really agree with him on everything, but he was a very deep thinking guy and kind of a pungent writer. And as I say, I'm not sure I agree with everything he says, but he did say some things that were certainly worth considering. And that concern he felt for the way we have come to regard each other, not as equals, but we've let our sort of tribal hatreds in some ways overtake our politics. That is a real concern. He thought it was really spelled the end of our some sort of political era, and he thought that we were going to pay a price for that before too long. Anyhow, it's something again worth pondering. I'm not certain exactly what time it is. But that was what I intended to read. And I can read more if anybody wants, but that was really it. And maybe we can go to Jessica, if you think it's time for questions, we can do that. Or
Yeah, I mean, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to type it in the chat or Q&A. You can also raise your hand so I can unmute you. Feel free to do that now. Maybe read one more section, Ed, and oh, Marta requests more reading, please.
oh, green. Okay, Marta. Marta happens to be an old friend. So hi,
Marta.
How are you? Let me take a moment and I will look around and find something. There's plenty here. Oh my. I'm afraid there's one, I'll read it. I'm afraid I stoop to obscenity in this one, so don't be shocked. It has to do with the term caucus. And the opening quotation comes from a guy, former one-time House of Representatives member, Morris Udall, served in the House up until 1981. Quote, "Do you know how to tell the difference between a cactus and a caucus?" End quote. And my entry begins this way. The origins of caucus are obscure. Historian Alvin Josephy Jr. traces it back to the Powhatan people of Virginia, from whom early English settlers picked it up. To the Powhatans, Josephy says, caucus meant counselor. But the term's early history is more strongly linked to colonial Massachusetts, where its modern meaning took shape. There was a caucus club in pre-revolution Boston, a group that met for drinking, smoking, and talking, with the talk inevitably turning to politics. In time, the club grew to a semi-secret society in which talk turned to activism. Samuel Adams was a caucus club regular, and it was in the milieu of such underground political gatherings that Adams and his Liberty Boys planned the Boston Tea Party. The word's essential meaning is found here. A caucus is a meeting of a political party or faction in which members plan ways to advance their causes. However provincial in its origins, the term caucus is now used in countries around the world: Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, even Nepal. In today's news, at least in America, the caucuses most often mentioned are those of the United States Congress, and the origins of the congressional caucuses shed light on the term's meaning. In the earliest years of the United States government, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton came up with a highly ambitious plan to solve the nation's deep financial problems. To translate his plan into action, however, Hamilton needed Congress to pass the necessary laws. So he met in private with sympathetic congressmen to plot a strategy for passing his program. Under Hamilton's guidance, they drafted specific legislation, decided who would introduce it, and how supporters would defend the plan in debate. This is typical caucus work. Hamilton had plenty of opponents, and they included powerful figures. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson was one, as was James Madison, then the leading figure in the House of Representatives. To counter the Hamiltonian program, these opponents also began to meet privately and plan how to foil it. In the efforts of these two camps, we see the origins of the caucus in Congress, as well as the origins of our first national political parties. Caucuses today have much the same function. Both Democrats and Republicans have caucuses in each house of Congress, though the Republicans call theirs conferences. These caucuses gather behind closed doors to set legislative goals, discuss how best to defend their policies before the public, vote for party leaders, and of course, plot ways to thwart their partisan enemies. Party caucuses in Congress can be convened whenever necessary, but are always held after elections when new members arrive in Washington. In the House, for example, the majority party the one with the most representatives, will hold a caucus to elect a majority leader and a majority whip. They'll also elect a caucus chair who will run the caucus meetings during that session of Congress. The majority party in the House will decide on its choice for Speaker of the House, though he or she will be elected in a vote of the whole House. The party out of power will hold a caucus as well, in which it votes for a minority leader, a minority whip, and its caucus chairperson. It's worth noting that there are congressional caucuses that are not party-based. Caucuses can form wherever members of Congress share legislative goals or some sense of solidarity with other members. There is, for example, a Congressional Black Caucus, which seeks to unite and strengthen African American voices, a Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and a Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues. In addition, there is a long list of caucuses that seek to raise the profile of specific issues within the legislature. The Congressional Caucus on Youth Sports is one, as are the Congressional Cystic Fibrosis Caucus, the Food Safety Caucus, and the Congressional Rock and Roll Caucus. That's the end of a section. And there's a little section that comes after that. And it begins like this. While caucuses bring together people who share a point of view, they are also the focal point of hot inter-party infighting and backstabbing. Representative Morris Mo Udall was reminded of this in 1971. Udall, an Arizonan, was much admired. Smart, hardworking, and likable, he rose in prominence among House Democrats. After 10 years in Congress, he decided to run for majority leader. In preparing for the caucus vote, he made the rounds of his Democratic colleagues asking for their support and gathering promises for their votes. Going into the caucus, he was upbeat. Coming out was another matter. To Udall's surprise, promised votes failed to materialize, and he fell well short of winning. Despite losing, however, he retained his sense of humor. In a press conference afterward, Udall asked reporters the rhetorical question, "Do you know the difference between a cactus and a caucus?" Not waiting for their reply, he answered himself, quote, "With a cactus, the pricks are on the outside," end quote. And end of that entry. This was a story that I actually heard growing up. My father did some work in Washington, brought him into contact, some with Mo Udall, and he just thought the world of Mo Udall. He loved Udall. Udall was, the prince among politicians to my father, and so when he heard this story, he got a big kick out of it, and I heard it going back to the age of, I don't know, 12 or 13 or something like that. So it was one that always amused me, and I was very happy to be able to include it in the book here. That's another one down. I can read more, or I don't know if more questions are coming up. Any other questions?
No questions, but Bill York wrote, "I like the idea that equal opportunity does not lead to equal outcome."
Who said that?
Bill York. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm reading a lot from an author right now who very much takes that position, and it's very interesting to read. It's a guy named Joseph Epstein, and very thoughtful guy, very smart. And anyhow, that's interesting to hear from Bill.
What was the most surprising thing you discovered in research when you were making this book?
I don't know. One of the things that was really interesting, and I'll reflect back on maybe for a moment on the term statute that I read earlier. There were always surprising depths to these terms and things that I learned all the time. I really enjoyed actually working on that term statute when I found that quotation from Benjamin Cardoso that said, "Constitutional law overrides statutes and statutes override the common law, the judge-made law." That sort of, for me, just brought a handful of things into focus. And I had heard the term statute and statutory for years and years. Never really knew what it meant in any specific way, but just that one quotation brought it into focus. And I found that so interesting and so useful, clarifying my own thinking about some of this. It reflected what the work of a legislature is, for instance, and it's so important in thinking through how our laws come about. So there were a lot of terms, though, that had that effect and that had that clarifying effect. A statute stands out, but another one, for instance, might be chief of staff. We hear about the chief of staff or presidential chiefs of staff. It turns out, I didn't realize this, it was a relatively new office. It really came with Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Eisenhower brought it from his military career as a general. He had had a chief of staff, and a guy named Walter Bedell Smith, General Smith, and this huge enterprise of organizing the invasion of Europe that Eisenhower had to manage. Having a chief of staff was important. When he came to Washington, when he was elected president, he brought that office with him, and we didn't really have it before then. That's sort of an interesting thing, and the growth of presidential staff in the post-war years and up to the present, that's also a very interesting story, and one in which the term chief of staff also plays a role, because staffs got so big and so unmanageable. Presidents couldn't really keep an eye on everybody and manage the whole thing, so having a chief of staff really became a necessity. One or another president tried to do without a chief of staff. It might have been Jimmy Carter early in his presidency, but found it was just unworkable, and so he brought a chief of staff in and named somebody to take that role. That was surprising to me that it's relatively new. Didn't go way back.
When researching for this book, how did you find all of the information and documents? What did your research entail?
Well, it was a very long, I set out with a kind of a plan in mind. It was a very long process. I gave myself lots and lots of time to do it, and that was very important. I kept an eye out as I was reading. One of the things I kept an eye out for were authors that I liked, and I would go back to them if I liked an author. I found that very useful. I kept an eye on footnotes, so even if I wasn't finding an author I particularly liked, and I had to work my way through plenty of writing that was a lot less than enthralling. A lot of it was kind of heavy lifting. But I kept an eye on footnotes so I could keep track of where to find blocks of information that would be useful. I also did something that I'm sort of pleased that I thought of this early on, and that is I developed a database of quotations. I was used to flagging sections of books that I liked going way back in my reading. But I took the further step on this project of actually creating a database so that as I read a book, I'd flag sections. And when I was done with the book, I'd go back to those flags. And if they still seemed sort of interesting or useful, I would type them up into a database that was searchable by, author, title, subject, and wound up with a little bit short of 3,000 quotations. And they were very useful. Some of them were sort of fun. The H.L. Mencken quotes, for instance, I had a bunch of them, and he was such a funny guy and colorful. But some of them were also just very useful. If I was stuck on an entry, I would sometimes just go back and look at quotations, and sometimes I'd find a crystallized thought around which I could organize. My thoughts would start sort of organizing themselves around that crystallized thoughts. So they were very useful. That was a very useful tool, that database.
Thank you. It's all really fascinating and interesting. Yeah. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand now or type it in there. Otherwise, I want to thank you a million times, Ed, for providing this program and creating this book. It's really important, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with this community.
Well, I'm very happy to. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. It was terrific. I enjoyed it, and you guys have been very helpful at the library, very responsive.
And everyone make sure to visit Edwin Hagenstein's website at edhagenstein.com. You can find copies of Language of Liberty at rootstockpublishing.com, or you can request to purchase it through local bookstores. Everyone, thank you so much for being here. Stay safe, read books, read the Language of Liberty. Have a great rest of your week. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Jessica.